Hello and welcome to the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mabardi. Today is Tuesday, March 12th. We are now 24 hours past the opening of NFL free agency, so we have all types of movement that we are going to cover. We have a handful of different segments today. We're going to be starting with the quarterback carousel. I'm going to be giving my winners and losers from the first 24 hours of free agency. We will then be getting into some of the drama around the NFC East. Of course, Saquon Barkley going to Philadelphia. Dak Prescott's brother went online and started giving some of his comments. The Cowboys have been not very active to start this free agency cycle. So we'll get into all of that and then wrap up by talking about the running back market. We are also going to try and stay up to date on as many of the breaking news headlines that come out as we speak. I know there was just one right before this show started involving former Ravens linebacker Patrick Queen. So we'll try and keep you up to date on everything as best we can. But before we get into the show, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you may be keeping up with us. To our live viewers, feel free to use the chat, give up any opinions or questions you may have. I will try to address all of those and make this show as interactive as possible. And if you would consider leaving a tip or donation, you can use the link that will be streaming across the bottom ticker throughout the show. That is gsmcpodcast.net. But without further ado, getting into our first segment of the show, talking about the quarterback carousel. We have had 9 different quarterback transactions up to this point since late Sunday night, and it was really headlined yesterday with the news that the Atlanta Falcons are signing Kirk Cousins to a 4-year contract worth $180 million. So the numbers automatically fly off the page for you here. An annual salary of $45 million per season. This is a very high price, of course, for any quarterback, but especially considering the fact that he is entering his age 36 season, coming off of a torn Achilles. He hasn't had the reputation of being a playoff performer. I believe it's just one playoff win in his career. So there's a lot of different factors coming into this. Now, quickly on the note of the Achilles, I feel like it's sort of one of two things here, because Kirk Cousins has never been a super mobile quarterback. He's been more of a traditional pocket passer, which I think is important when saying it's not like he's relied on his athleticism. But I also feel like the discussion that's been coming out is sort of downplaying that injury a little bit because he's not a scrambler. Every quarterback still needs his mobility. If you look at Tom Brady, who was quite the opposite of a scrambling quarterback, what partially made him so special was his ability to maneuver the pocket. I do feel like at a little bit more of an advanced age, that is a factor, although I don't think that means it is going to be, career devastating for Kirk Cousins. But I did want to point it out. I think a lot of people are a little bit overlooking this injury, at least in terms of some of the people in the national media. But like we see every single season, everybody freaks out when they first see the numbers that are attached to these QB contracts before all of the details are released. And more times than not, they're not quite as aggressive maybe as they at first appear. For Cousins and this deal, the first 2 years are fully guaranteed. And then from that point on, a lot of it is not fully guaranteed, and the Falcons could have an out. Some people are saying that the out comes after 2 years. SpotRack, SPOTRAC, is a website that I use all the time. It's extremely reliable when it comes to professional athlete contracts, and on their current website, they list the Falcons having the out coming after the 2026 season, so that's 3 years. the details are still coming out here, but one way or another, it does not seem like they're going to be stuck paying an old Kirk Cousins for all 4 of these seasons. And the thing is, if the out does come after 2 seasons, it does line up pretty well with some of their evaluation of some of the surrounding picks that they have there in Atlanta. Drake London is somebody they spent a first-round pick on just a couple years ago in the 2022 draft, and he really hasn't had a reliable quarterback situation since entering the Atlanta Falcons organization, and now he's going to have a chance to get himself fully prepared, and for having the Falcons be able to evaluate him a little bit better. It is 2 seasons until they have to place the 5th-year option on him, so should be nice evaluation there. Both of their starting tackles additionally have 2 years left before there is an out in their deals, so evaluation all around for the Falcons on this front. I think in terms of the conversation about what does this do for the Falcons, it automatically makes them the favorite in the NFC South. That is the case on the majority of sports books as of this morning. And I can understand why. First off, keep in mind that the NFC South is not a very good division. It was really a crapshoot for a lot of last year. The Buccaneers end up coming out of it just barely, escaping their way by. The Saints were a mess at times. The Falcons won 7 games, though, last year with a really rough quarterback situation. And now they bring in a guy like Kirk Cousins, who they are hoping can elevate the group at least to some degree. Their defense last year was a bit overachieving, and now they bring in a really nice defensive mind in Raheem Morris as their head coach to hopefully help further elevate the group. The talent on the defensive side of the ball is a little bit lackluster, but Jesse Bates, the safety they brought in last offseason, he is great, put together a terrific season for them last year as well. I really like Caden Ellis. He had a career season last year as well. So they also have the 8th overall pick in the upcoming draft. And if you look at a lot of mock drafts and prospect rankings, seems like a lot of the first handful of picks are going to be offensive players, which means that the Falcons actually have a chance to be able to take the first defensive player off the board with the 8th overall pick from the 3 quarterbacks that are sure to go in the top 3, potentially maybe even a JJ McCarthy sliding into one of those top spots as well. You have a couple really good offensive tackle prospects and some really elite receivers as well. So Dallas Turner is somebody from Alabama, a little nearby to Atlanta, could be a really nice addition for them, getting an edge rusher, whether it's him, whether it's Jared Verse, who it's probably going to be Dallas Turner that goes the first defensive position, but I do like that for the Falcons as well. Now, of course, the Kirk Cousins move here does leave an opening in Minnesota, and the Vikings decided to close that opening by bringing in Sam Darnold, a 1-year deal worth $10 million. He is definitely not a lock to be the week 1 starter for Minnesota next season, but he's going to have a chance to compete for the position where they don't really have any secure answers as of this moment. Darnold did start 1 game last year for the 49ers just in week 18, where the team had locked up playoff positioning and they were resting a lot of their starters. The last time that he was actually given the starter job was down the stretch in 2022, where he started 6 games for the Panthers, threw for 1,143 yards, 7 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. The Panthers were 4-2 in those games, so, depending on whether or not you think wins are a quarterback stat, I tend to not really think so. And clearly the Panthers didn't really either in this situation last year, where it wasn't a convincing enough performance to stop them from trading up to the number 1 overall pick in the 2023 draft to take Bryce Young. So Darnold is somebody that I think could have had a different career path had the Jets not really failed him. You could make the argument. They took him third overall in 2018, and just the way that we've seen them develop quarterbacks over the course of the past decade, it has been clear that they haven't really had all too much of a clue as to how to do so. Darnold had some talent coming into the NFL, but as we saw, eventually he was seeing ghosts out there. The iconic quote that he gave during the Monday Night Football game against the Patriots, and he just never really found his way. Now, I think the Vikings, it's a fine addition. I don't necessarily see it being any sort of a long-term deal, even though Sam Darnold is still not on the too much of the older side either. He could potentially find a way to bounce back. He was in the same draft class as Baker Mayfield, who just got in $100 million deal over the weekend, despite being in the same draft class and also having a bumpy start to his career. So Sam Darnold is currently 26. He'll be 27 when the season starts next year. So maybe he finds his way as the starter for the Vikings. They also could definitely consider using some draft capital to address the position as well. I've seen some mock drafts that have had them trading up to select a quarterback. So definitely an interesting situation there. Russell Wilson signed with the Steelers on Sunday, which we already talked about at length on the show yesterday. You can go on YouTube to find the clips there if you want some more in-depth analysis there. In my opinion, just briefly, I thought it was a fine move. I think it's a great deal getting him for just over $1 million, but I'm also not convinced it is this massive upgrade over Kenny Pickett that is going to make the Steelers any sort of a Super Bowl contender. Again, fine move. I just don't know if Russell Wilson still really has it like that. And he talked about wanting 2 more Super Bowls. Let's start with seeing if they can make the playoffs next year or if he can win the starting job, which again, probably should be able to, but I don't think it's this night and day upgrade either. We also had the Raiders go out and sign Gardner Minshew to a 2-year contract worth $25 million. Minshew took over for the Colts last year when Anthony Richardson went down early in the season, and the Colts ended up having a pretty successful year as a whole considering the expectations, especially after Richardson went down. They were 9-8. They faced off against the Texans in the final game of their regular season. They had a chance to beat them to make the playoffs. They end up blundering that game on a 4th down opportunity from the Texans' 15-yard line with just about a minute left. And it was on a play where Gardner Minshew was a little bit off on a pass that was shortened out to running back Tyler Goodson. Wasn't a good pass. Goodson definitely could have caught it as well. Also, but the couple things here, because I'm not going to get too much into this specific instance. Weird that was even the decision as a whole. Jonathan Taylor was on the bench. Not going to rehash all of this Colts single-handedly play calling during the course of the regular season. I think it is an example, though, of how Gardner Minshew is a very solid quarterback, but he is also a little bit flawed. And for the Raiders here, I think he ideally just brings in a little bit more stability to that Raiders offense. They really have not been able to trust Jimmy Garoppolo when they brought him in last year. Aiden O'Connell was definitely not reliable either for them. So as it currently stands, Minshew will be competing with Aiden O'Connell for the starting job next year, but they are also another team that could look to go out and draft a quarterback as well. Antonio Pierce supposedly has connections back to Arizona State with Jaden Daniels. That feels like a far way from them climbing up to, I believe they're at 14, up to number 2, number 3 to get Jaden Daniels. But something to consider at least. Interesting note here, the Falcons, Vikings, and Raiders were three of the main teams that were potentially linked to Justin Fields, and now they've all went out and spent money to fill the position. Now, Darnold and Minshew aren't like they are long-term franchise options, but they do go out and spend now to give up more draft capital as well. If they knew that this was just for a backup quarterback, would be a little bit interesting. Now, the price for Fields has definitely went down, and that's something we'll touch more on when we get to the winners and losers segment next. But something I wanted to point out there quickly here, running through the last few quarterback moves. Baker Mayfield re-signed with the Buccaneers. 3 years, $100 million. Gotta say, the price doesn't look quite as bad this morning as it did yesterday. Not that I still sort of agreed with the Bucs giving out $30 million to Baker, but seeing how much Kirk Cousins got as well, not a bad move, I don't think, for the Buccaneers. The Patriots shuffled around their quarterback situation as well. On Sunday, they traded Mac Jones to the Jaguars for a 6th-round pick. Yesterday, they signed Jacoby Brissett to a 1-year deal for $8 million. I do think that I like this deal for the Patriots. Brissett obviously briefly started his career with the Patriots before bouncing around a few different teams when they traded him to the Colts, but you can definitely make the argument, I'm just saying make the argument, not definitively, that he was the best quarterback on each of the past 2 teams he's been on. Deshaun Watson was extremely rusty when he came back from suspension in 2022. The Browns defense was not the level of Browns defense as it was last year, so it's not like the team was having success, but I also don't think that Brissett was hurting them necessarily when he filled in as the starter for Watson. And Brissett ended up finishing that season with a better passer rating and QBR than Watson, again, just for that 1 year, but all things considered. And I do like some of the flashes that we've seen from Sam Howell, but he has clear flaws and really tough moments as well. So Brissett, when he came in there, looked like a competent guy for them as well. But ultimately, it's not saying much here. Brissett isn't a franchise guy, but I think he can provide a lot more stability for the Patriots than they've had the past couple seasons. I think that he could be a great bridge option if they choose to go that way. They maybe stick with him. They maybe draft a quarterback 3rd overall. But I do think that this Patriots team can at least be a lot less incompetent. They were really bad this past year. Their defense was still good, but they got so little from their offense that it was pretty much a wash. I think that Brissett could possibly lead the Patriots to more stability. And again, not saying much, but a little bit of a better season. As I did just mention, Washington and Sam Howell, the Commanders went out and signed Marcus Mariota just to a 1-year deal, likely going to be the backup. But I do think that this also means they will probably be parting ways with Sam Howell this offseason. They have the 2nd overall pick. They are widely expected to take a quarterback. So I feel like this is probably meaning that Howell will be in a new location. Again, don't think Mariota is going to be the starter necessarily, but that is sort of just the situation there in Washington. The final move in terms of quarterbacks was Jameis Winston. He signed with the Browns. That means no more Joe Flacco in Cleveland, even though he did put together quite the little Cinderella run to help lead them to the playoffs. They bring Winston in on a 1-year deal. He's going to be the backup for Deshaun Watson next season, and it should make for a pretty interesting quarterback room where you have a couple former highly drafted quarterbacks. Jameis is the best in terms of his personality and everything, but putting it all together hasn't really been there. Watson, we know the flashes that could be there, but he hasn't really either. And I think that it's just going to be a very interesting quarterback room to watch next season. But that is all we have time for on this. Stick with us. We will be right back, and I will be giving out my winners and losers for the first day of free agency. So stick with us. We will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, no, this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just finished up talking about the quarterback moves in the NFL from the first 24 hours of free agency. We highlighted the 9 moves that had taken place, just checked, and during the end of that segment, we actually had one other move, some breaking news that Drew Lock will be headed to the Giants, ultimately in a backup role, but there's a couple things that stand out to me briefly about this, and that is that the Giants had been sort of in the rumor mill of potentially looking to trade up for a quarterback in the upcoming draft. That seems a lot less likely now at this moment. Either that or they are going to eat the dead money or try and trade off Daniel Jones. I don't know if that's quite as likely, but is an interesting little development there. Also interesting because the Seahawks had talked about the fact that they were intrigued in Drew Lock in the long term. He had a chance to potentially take over the starting role this past year. They brought back Geno Smith, but their GM, who I'm blanking on his name at the moment, he said that he was a believer in Drew Lock, and now he is out of the building. Does this mean that the Seahawks, I had been thinking about the idea that they could be a dark horse for a Justin Fields. Maybe this clears the way a little bit more. Maybe it means that they are going to draft a quarterback themselves. Time will tell, but a little bit of an interesting development there. But we will be now getting into my list of winners and losers from the first day of free agency. Let me know what you guys think in the comments in terms of who won or lost, but we are going to start with the first winner, which is Kirk Cousins. This is a little bit of an obvious one, but heading into his age 36 season, coming off a torn Achilles and making $45 million annually, that is a big time win. He gets to go to an Atlanta offense that I thought was the most appealing destination for any quarterbacks on the move coming into this offseason, where you have pass catchers in Drake London and Kyle Pitts. You have a backfield behind you of Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier, a young, solid offensive line as well. They also just went out and signed Darnell Mooney today, former Bears wide receiver. So plenty of options there. I think that Kirk Cousins should do very well. He is doing very well for himself in terms of financially. One of the best of his generation in terms of getting his contracts, but also going to be in a very solid position come the actual NFL season. My second winner I have is the running back market. I think that this has been a big conversation over the past couple off-season in terms of how much can you actually pay running backs. Is it worth giving them a second contract? And they go out, and a bunch of them end up getting multi-year deals. Saquon and Josh Jacobs both get deals that include over $12 million annually. So I think that this was a nice development for the running back market in terms of those guys getting paid. Clearly, as you saw from some of these moves, the future of the position likely is somewhat tied to being able to catch the ball out of the backfield. I know that Eckler didn't quite get the same dollar value, but I also think that his best years are just behind him. We saw real regression last year, but overall, I think he still gets a contract. A bunch of these running backs switched up positions, played musical chairs, and ended up being eventful for the running backs. Next winner I have is Bryce Young. The Panthers attempted to upgrade their offensive line. They signed a couple new starting guards that should be upgrades for them for this upcoming season. Bryce Young, obviously a very small stature and somebody that the weapons still aren't great, but at least they are starting to try and help things get easier for him as he heads into his sophomore season. The Panthers signed Robert Hunt from the Miami Dolphins, 5-year deal, $100 million, and they also signed Damian Lewis from the Seahawks to a 4-year, $53 million contract as well. They're hoping that their first-round pick from 2022, Ikem Ekwonu, who they took 6th overall, can take a step forwards as well. He is a tackle. He's been fine for them, but definitely not quite the level of success they were hoping to see from him yet. So they still definitely have a ways to go when it comes to some of the playmaking weapons as well. But I do think that this is a nice development for the future of Bryce Young. Next winner I have is the Vikings defense. Headed into last season, Minnesota was definitely lacking some playmakers on the defensive side of the ball. I thought that Brian Flores did a good job scheming them into some pretty solid defensive numbers as a unit as a whole, but it was very clear with them they were very heavily reliant on blitzing. They did so more than any other team in the league last season, blitzed on 51.5% of opposing teams' dropbacks, which was significantly the most. And they ended up being middle of the pack in a lot of these statistics. I know that middle of the pack isn't great, but I also thought that they had a lot of holes going into the season. But where they struggled the most was pass defense and third down defense. They do still have some holes in the secondary, but I really did like the additions that they made to get a more effective pass rush. They bring in Jonathan Grenard of the Houston Texans from last year. He had 12.5 sacks last season, was top 20 in the league in pressures with 32. He's a very promising young player. They add Andrew Van Ginkel as well, who turned in a nice season. He reunites with Brian Flores when the two of them were in Miami together. He had a couple of his best seasons early in his career when Flores was involved in the defense there. Van Ginkel, I think, was a nice addition as well. And they also brought in Blake Cashman, a very underrated, in my eyes, young linebacker. Had a career season last year, so they add a couple Texans. They add one of Flores' former guys, and I think it should help to at least solidify their front seven a little bit more. Again, they are still weak in the secondary, but ideally now, with guys like Grenard and Van Ginkel, they can generate more pressure from their front four as opposed to relying on a lot of blitz-heavy calls, and I think that that is a step in the right direction for them. They don't end up getting Kirk Cousins, the Vikings as a whole, but they put that money to pretty good use, in my opinion. They are going to lose Danielle Hunter, who just had 16.5 sacks for them, so that does hurt, but they are getting younger. They're getting more well-rounded. Do still need to add in the secondary, though. I have a few light winners here. I do think that the Patriots won a little bit from the first 24 hours. They retained the key free agents that were hitting the open market: Michael Onwenu, Hunter Henry, and the deal hasn't been finalized yet, but Kyle Duggar, they placed the transition tag on, so should be able to bring back all of those guys. They signed Jacoby Brissett to a deal. Could be a very nice bridge option for the offense that has a lot of holes. So even if they go in and bring in a quarterback in the draft, that is, they still have a little bit of a ways to go. The deal for Brissett was just 1 year, $8 million. I thought the fact that they were able to get him cheaper for what the Vikings signed Sam Darnold for was pretty solid for them. I would rather have Brissett than Darnold. I understand maybe the ceiling with Darnold is a little bit higher, but I just trust Brissett. I think he is a real professional. He doesn't lose you games, and ultimately the Patriots can take a step forward. It's pretty hard for them to take a step back after the disaster that last season was, but bringing in Brissett does potentially give them some more upside and gives them a little bit of flexibility in terms of what they would want to do with a rookie quarterback should they decide to draft one. They added Antonio Gibson as a third down running back as well to back up Ramondre Stevenson, who spent a lot of time last year ineffective and also injured down the stretch of the year. They did have to bite the bullet on Devontae Parker, who they released. They're going to have to take on $6.3 million in dead money, but it opens up a spot in the receiver room after a few dreadful seasons for Parker. Warren Sharp on Twitter tweeted out that Devontae Parker was dead last in creating separation the past 4 seasons according to NFL Next Gen Stats, and that checks out from the eye test as well. Pats still have a long way to go, but I think they did what they needed to yesterday. Another slight winner I have here is Will Levis. I just liked a couple of the pieces that they added that should make the quarterback job easier for whoever is in for the Titans next year, assuming it's going to be Levis. They add Lloyd Cushenberry, the center for the Broncos. He's definitely an upgrade from what they had last year, and he's a very solid pass blocker. They make him the 3rd highest paid center in the league. They also bring in Tony Pollard. Pollard is not an upgrade over Derrick Henry. It is a step back, but I do think that he can also work in this position for them. He's definitely more of a receiving threat than Henry ever was, which could help Levis as well. Now, Pollard was not very efficient last year in the run game or receiving game, but perhaps him and Tyjae Spears can make a nice little duo there. They also added a little bit of help in the secondary, the Titans did. Not that affects Levis, but they bring in Chidobe Awuzie, who has been recovering from an ACL injury, showed some promise again last year. My final winner here is the Commanders. Under new head coach Dan Quinn, they bring in a couple of his former Cowboys, Tyler Biadasz and Dorrance Armstrong, 2 very solid players. I think that Armstrong is more of a rotational piece, but I do think he went pretty underrated on that Dallas defense. Biadasz is a really nice centerpiece for them on the offensive line. They also get Austin Eckler at a very cheap price, just 2 years, $11.43 million. His best years are absolutely behind him, but could be a nice piece to put alongside the young and promising Brian Robinson Jr. 2 running backs that can catch passes, should be able to help out whoever their next starting quarterback is. And ultimately, I thought that the moves, again, not super drastic, but steps in the right direction for them. Now on to the losers. I have the Dallas Cowboys, the only team that did not make a move yesterday. They lose Pollard, Dorrance Armstrong, and Tyler Biadasz. It was rumored that they were interested in Zach Moss, but the price was too high. Moss ends up going to Cincinnati. And this is coming into an offseason where Jerry Jones said they were going to be all in, which obviously gets aggregated a little bit extra because it's Jerry Jones, because it's the Cowboys. But we are going to have to see what this all in really does pan out to be. But Jerry Jones's comments aside, I feel like their priority will likely be trying to get Dak Prescott, CeeDee Lamb, and Micah Parsons all on extensions. So this offseason isn't necessarily a loss for them, but it is off to a really slow start, and to not do anything in the first 24 hours does make them a loser in my eyes. Justin Jefferson is another loser coming out of yesterday. Vikings losing Kirk Cousins, signing Sam Darnold to replace him, and there is still a strong chance that it could end up being somebody else, whether that's in the draft. I don't think that Justin Fields is in play for them, but maybe they try and make something work there. As of now, though, Darnold does project to be the Week 1 starter. You can argue that Jefferson might end up being a winner for the sole fact that the Vikings might have to pay him some record-setting money to get him to stay with the team, but I don't think that Justin Jefferson, should he be in a Vikings jersey next year, is going to feel like too much of a winner during the year with whatever quarterback he's playing with. Who knows? Maybe something pans out there. Maybe it's Darnold. Maybe it's a rookie. But to me, I think it feels like Justin Jefferson lost. The next loser here, going to try and speed it up down the stretch a little bit here. But I do think that the Bears and Justin Fields are a loser. The quarterback cycle has come around a lot, and Fields is still on the Bears with a very limited market. Now, I would imagine he's still going to be traded. I think that he could still get an opportunity. But for the Bears here to have not gotten anything of value for him, and his value is only going to continue to drop, I think, as we get closer to the draft, it is a little bit damning for them. Now, interestingly, the Mac Jones was traded on Sunday for just a 6th round pick. He, of course, if you go back to the 2021 NFL draft, he went just 4 picks after Justin Fields did. The trajectory of their careers are headed in opposite directions, which is why the public perception of Fields is so much higher than Mac Jones. But I'm curious what that looks like within NFL front offices, because I think I would argue that Mac Jones had a better rookie season than any season that Justin Fields has put together. Now, Fields actually somehow received an MVP vote for last season. Now, he was incredible on the ground. I do think that his floor is higher because of his athletic ability, but the point being, the Bears were hoping for a day 2 draft pick or along those lines for Justin Fields, and now a comparable quarterback has just gone for only a 6th round draft pick. Does not bode well for the Bears or for Fields, really, who's hoping to be a starter this upcoming season. I think that the Panthers owner, David Tepper, is a loser because of the Brian Burns situation. It just really blew up in his face. They turned down the offer of 2 first-round picks and a 2nd rounder a couple seasons ago. You've likely heard the story already, but they stuck it out with Burns for the next year and a half to accomplish very little. They were unwilling to negotiate a contract with him, and they sold low for just a 2nd and a 5th round pick. Unless you think that Brian Burns is going to fall off of a cliff, why would you trade him now at this point and sell so low? Why not pay him and move on from him at a later date during the season or maybe next off season? The Panthers are a bad team right now. They don't have very many great players on their roster or anybody they're going to have to pay drastic money to in the near future. I feel like they could have slow played this more if they were willing to play ball with him. They don't. And I do know that they had a change in GM, but David Tepper has been known to be a hands-on owner over his tenure, and I think that he becomes a loser the way that this all played out. Last couple losers here. Any defensive front in the AFC, the Ravens just signed Derrick Henry. That is a very terrifying thought for anybody playing the Ravens with Lamar Jackson's ability to run and with Derrick Henry being the power back that he is. They should be getting Keaton Mitchell back from injury this season. I think the Ravens run game, which was the best in the league last year, is actually going to get better. Gus Edwards did head out the door to the Chargers, but still, I think Henry is an upgrade, and that makes for a very scary sight. My final loser here is Patrick Mahomes and any other AFC West quarterbacks. The fact that Max Crosby and Christian Wilkins are going to be on the same defensive line is going to be terrifying for any quarterback lining up across from them. AFC West, of course, plays the Raiders twice a year, but that is, again, I can't overstate how excited I am to watch that specific pairing. I think that the two of them are some of the best at their positions, and I think that it's just going to be a lot of fun to see play out. So we are going to take our next break here. I do have a couple other, not winners or losers, but people that fell right outside of the margin, but we don't have time to get into it right now. So we are going to be taking our second break. When we come back on the other side, I will be giving my gray area teams in terms of winners and losers, and I will be recapping some of the drama that has taken place in the NFC East. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just finished up giving the winners and losers from day one of NFL free agency. Now we are going to get into the NFC East free agency drama that took place. I do want to briefly touch on a couple teams that were in my gray area for winners and losers, and they are relevant to this segment. In terms of, we have a couple NFC East teams, starting off with the Philadelphia Eagles. I consider them to be somewhere in the middle when it comes to winners and losers so far, where they bring in Saquon Barkley, they lock down offensive lineman Landon Dickerson, and they sign edge rusher Bryce Huff. Saquon, the deal is nice, the fit seems like it's going to be good, but I also don't think that running back was one of their top needs. He's definitely an upgrade from DeAndre Swift. I feel like there's probably some sort of an element in terms of poaching off one of your division rivals, fan favorite players, that probably is pretty sweet for them as well. I can just imagine Saquon probably taking those games personally based off of the ownership not wanting to pay him the contract, despite him wanting to stay with the Giants for as long as possible. But I just think that the defense is a real concern. We saw them lose their top two tacklers from their Super Bowl run, and they're yet to really address that yet. Now, they did draft Nolan Smith, I believe his name is. I always blank on his last name, but the linebacker out of Georgia that they took late in the draft last year was Nolan Smith. They took him 30th overall. He had a pretty disappointing rookie season. Now maybe he can bounce back this year, but they definitely do need help in that linebacking core. They get to bring in Bryce Huff, who again is a very nice player. He's been more of a rotational guy up to this point. He only played 42% of defensive snaps for the Jets last season. He started 7 games in the 2021 season hasn't started a game in the rest of his 3 years. Now, he still gave really good production last year as a rotational piece, and I think that he can fill in, especially with the absence of Fletcher Cox, who just retired for the Eagles. But I do think that they are still a couple moves on that defensive side of the ball away. I like the addition of Vic Fangio as their new defensive coordinator. I think that that's an upgrade as well. And maybe he, who at times has been known to be a little bit blitz heavy, could make up for some of the lack of strength in the secondary. Kevin Byard just left in free agency as well, I believe, so he will not be back with the Eagles. That was one of their deadline moves as well. But all in all here with the Eagles, I think that it's definitely a nice step forward. I'm not really a believer in being able to win a Super Bowl in March as it is, and a lot of people are really hopping on the train here in terms of the Eagles being back on their way to a Super Bowl. I think they still have a couple moves to make in order to actually solidify that. They do re-sign Brandon Graham, which is nice, but like I mentioned, Fletcher Cox retires, and so does Jason Kelce. So those are some other holes. Again, Huff sort of fills in one of those, but I don't think they are done. My next team in the gray area here I have is the Packers, where they made some upgrades. They bring in Josh Jacobs in the running back room, Xavier McKinney in the secondary. And this was pretty uncommon for the Packers historically. They've never been a super active team in free agency, which was just a little bit cool and surprising to see. You move on from Aaron Jones, who they released, Darnell Savage, who was a free agent. They're both good players, so I wouldn't say this was massive upgrades at positions of extreme needs. I do think the Packers need to be better in the secondary, so McKinney should be a good addition to that. But I did like both of these signings for the Packers. Aaron Jones does end up on the Minnesota Vikings, so I have to imagine that hurts at least a little bit for Packers fans. But they, all in all, again, solid plays for both of these. They do also move off of David Bakhtiari, so he, even more so than Aaron Jones, but had been a staple of the Packers for a while. Since 2013, had multiple All-Pro selections for them, but he's been injured in 2 of the past 3 seasons where he was only able to play 1 game. It was probably best for them to move on. They are a young team and have a young core going forward. Final team here, and then we're going to be diving into the full NFC East. But on that note, it is the New York Giants. Being able to trade for Brian Burns for just a 2nd rounder and a 5th rounder is really nice value for them. They coughed up money to extend him to a 5-year contract that could be worth up to $150 million deal. $87.5 million of that is guaranteed. So they paid him. Burns is great. I don't know if I personally see him as a top 5 pass rusher in the league, but ultimately it's no real complaints, again, especially for the draft capital that it took for them to get him. I feel like that's a really nice deal. I think the contract is ultimately pretty fair. Giants fans were appalled at the way that the day was playing out. Before that happened, when Saquon Barkley left for Philadelphia and they replaced him with Devin Singletary. Singletary had a solid year for Houston. He did nothing for the first half of the year, did come around as the Texans sort of started making that playoff push. So Singletary is a solid option. They're paying him just over $5 million per year. Really nothing all too much, but is definitely a little harmful in terms of just, again, the fandom of how much Giants fans love Saquon Barkley. Now, I don't think it would have made sense for them to give Saquon the type of contract that the Eagles gave him. It more so leads to a conversation about how they handled last offseason with Barkley and Daniel Jones, franchise tagging Saquon, giving Jones the long-term deal. But come this year, there was really nothing they could do about that. They lose McKinney as well, which isn't ideal. And between him and Saquon, they probably could have found a way to tag and trade at least one of them. But overall, I thought the Giants did fine for themselves. They also brought in a guard from the Raiders in Jermaine Illuminor. So he has started the past couple seasons for the Raiders. Giants need help on the offensive line. So I thought that it was overall a solid day for them. But getting more into the NFC East as a whole, of course, this drama around the Saquon Barkley to Philadelphia deal sort of shook the internet, where you had former Giants running back Tiki Barber get on radio and said that Saquon was dead to him and to Giants fans. Saquon responded with a tweet that has since been deleted, but talking about how Barber has never been kind and accepting to him and that he doesn't care, and did seem to try and make it vocal that he wanted to stay with the Giants, but they weren't willing to give him what he felt he deserved, which is definitely true to some degree. Again, I do tend to agree with the Giants that it wouldn't have made sense. They have too many other needs to cough up all that money to a running back, but was just a very messy ending as they fell out of it, which sort of brings me to the question of, should Giants fans be upset with Saquon Barkley? And I feel like the likely consensus answer with Giants fans is no, they're mad at the front office for the way that this is all played out. And obviously it hurts for... You can make the argument that could have signed with a handful of other teams, but for the deal that Saquon was able to get, I mean, I don't know how, especially as we're going to talk a little bit about in the final segment of the show, it's not like running backs have had all this level of leverage in contract negotiations, and he got a very solid deal, 3 years, $37.75 million from the Eagles. So, you know, Saquon, he's dealt with a handful of injuries over the course of his career. Now he lands in a spot that, again, I think schematically should be a really nice fit for him and playing into the Eagles offense. But another interesting thing came of this in that we had Dak Prescott's brother, tweet out about how the Eagles are the best front office in the NFL. This came after the Saquon signing and the fact that the Cowboys have been very uneventful in these early stages of free agency, and it just adds to the further drama around the Cowboys. I don't want to harp on it all too much in terms of the all-in quote from Jerry Jones. We know that it probably wasn't his best idea to say that, but when is Jerry Jones getting on the microphone ever really a great idea for the Cowboys as a whole? It hasn't stopped them, but it does make for a very interesting conversation about how this division is going to play out, because, again, I don't think that the Eagles getting a running back, for as good of a talent as Saquon Barkley is, I don't think it fully pushes the needle for them. And if your counter argument is Christian McCaffrey to the 49ers, I will concede that. I do think that McCaffrey transformed the 49ers when he got there. But I also feel like there has to be some level of, the 49ers defense is so much better than the Eagles right now. And the Eagles have had all this turnover with their coordinators the past couple of years. I just don't think that saying you have this running back. You went out and you got DeAndre Swift last season. Now, Saquon is definitely better than DeAndre Swift when he's playing, but there's also still concern in terms of whether or not Saquon can be a healthy guy throughout the course of the season. And obviously, I'm not rooting for him to be injured. I think that it would be a lot of fun to see how this all plays out. But it's going to come down to, can Jalen Hurts sort of return to form after a disappointing season last year? And what are they going to do to address the defense? Because I do feel like outside of that front line where they have a lot of talent, I think that they are pretty vulnerable on the defensive side of the ball. And I don't know. I just think that it's so pointless, really, to call the division like already when we are a day into free agency. There's so much that has to go on from here. But that also being said, there is going to come a time where the Cowboys are going to have to make a move one way or another. I don't think that they can fully run this all back next year, where they were a very good regular season team and they still have plenty of talent on the roster, but you bring back your quarterback, you bring back your head coach, you do lose your defensive coordinator, but I would have assumed that after the way that playoff game against the Packers went, they weren't going to bring him back because you have to change something. And as of right now, the only changes have been losses, where they are down 3 of their key guys from last year in Pollard, Biotish, and Armstrong. And Stephon Gilmore as well, I believe, is exiting the team as well. So I would prefer their moves to be on the defensive side of the ball. I think probably more so, specifically with linebackers. I think they could definitely get some help there. A little bit of an underwhelming group last season. I thought that they were fine in terms of their secondary when they played man coverage through the course of the year. It was just a little bit of a weird transition. I'm not sure why they decided to play soft coverage against the Packers in that wild card game. But they do have guys still in Diggs and Deron Bland that, while they can be a little bit hit or miss on individual plays, they do still have a lot of talent. And I'm just very curious to see how the Cowboys are going to turn this thing around, because I do consider them losers up to this point in free agency. But that is all we have time for on this subject. We are going to be taking our final break, and when we come back, we will be talking about some breaking news as well as the running back market as a whole. So stick with us and we will be right back. Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast. We are headed into our final segment of the day. We're going to be talking about some running back moves. I also do briefly just want to touch on a couple of the moves from today. During the course of this show, we haven't had a chance to talk about it just yet, but we do have the news that the Steelers are signing former Ravens linebacker Patrick Queen. Now, obviously, Saquon going from the Giants to the Eagles is drawing a lot of attention in terms of inter-division moves, but this is a pretty significant one. Very interesting to see how this is going to play out. Patrick Queen has shown a lot of highs in his career. Now, some of his best days did come after they traded for Roquan Smith at the trade deadline during the 2022 season. So there, I think, was a little bit of hesitation from Baltimore, the organization, to trust Patrick Queen to be a real franchise cornerstone guy, but did finish All-Pro second team this past year, and he gets a 3-year, $41 million contract. Is an interesting move for sure, as the Steelers are hoping to take their team to the next level. Of course, sign Russell Wilson, and we will see how everything plays out there in Pittsburgh. But one other team that I want to briefly mention before getting on to the running backs here is the fact that I did not have the Rams as a winner, but they definitely have a real argument as the way this has played out so far. A few days ago, they re-signed their guard Kevin Dotson, who was a big addition for them coming into the team this past season, and put together some really nice games for them. They go out and they signed the guard from the Lions, Jonah Jackson, who had an incredible season, and he should provide a lot of value for that team as well. They also just went out and addressed some of their secondary needs, where they went and signed former Jaguars cornerback Darius Williams. The Rams were very young on the defensive side of the ball last year. They were relying a lot on Raheem Morris to sort of bring the most out of the youth that was on the roster. And now they are able to bring in a new guy that should be more of a legitimate cornerback one for them this upcoming year. But on that note, we're going to get into the running back market here, where we talked about it a little bit. I considered running backs to be a winner as a whole, just as a position from this offseason, based off of the fact that we were seeing more multi-year deals that were, we got a handful of contracts that were over $8 million. We got a couple $12 million plus contracts in terms of annual value. And I know that it's not something to necessarily write home about, but I do think that it was a step in the right direction after last year, where we saw guys having to settle for some one-year deals at a pretty cheap rate because of the fact that they weren't expected to get the level of contracts that they were hoping for going into it. You had Josh Jacobs and Saquon Barkley both getting franchise tagged last year, having to work through negotiations in the front office to even show up at the beginning of the year, and they end up seeing themselves get a boost in terms of the value. Now, we did see the salary cap as a whole take an increase, which probably did not hurt them by any means, but with the number of running backs that were also on the open market, there was a little bit of a chance that the quantity of them was going to dilute the value a little bit, and I don't think that was really the case. You look at Saquon and Jacobs specifically, who were prime franchise tag candidates, and the fact that they got more annual value than they would have had they just been franchise tagged. The number this year was just over $12 million, and they were able to reach that. So I think that that's a really positive development for them. And I think that specifically looking at these two in particular is important, because you have to keep in mind their ability to catch out of the backfield. Now, this isn't necessarily law, because we saw Austin Eckler struggle to get the same sort of a contract, but I also think Eckler, for as incredible as he's been the past handful of years, he just really looked to be worn down last season. He's been an extremely high usage guy through the course of his career with the Chargers, and last year dealt with an injury early in the season as well that he just never really fully recovered from. But he gets a 2-year deal, so maybe he can turn things around. I don't know. At this point, he's going into his age 29 season. It doesn't seem like his best years are still ahead of him, but I don't think that that's a necessarily big time lesson for the league as a whole. I think that we're shifting more so to a little bit of the college style of offense, which maybe isn't exactly what running backs want to hear, but where it's a lot more by committee, and that's where I think that a lot of these guys can shine. I do think that Eckler can find a way to be a little bit of a committee guy. The workhorse bell cow running back doesn't really seem to still be existing in the NFL quite the level that we have seen it do so in the past, but you are able to at least make an argument for yourself being of higher value if you do have a little bit more versatility. And that's where I think that Christian McCaffrey is a little bit the golden boy of what running backs should look to sort of make their game look like. Alvin Kamara used to be a really good example. He sort of tailed off as the years came as well, but the fact that the 49ers can trust Christian McCaffrey to line up just about anywhere, can trust him to run routes. I'm not saying make yourself a wide receiver, but at least being able to have that positional versatility and be able to give different looks, because I think that's something that's been very interesting in the NFL over the course of the past handful of years, is the innovation on both the offensive and defensive side of the ball, where coaches are still finding a way to provide different looks to the opposing team. And specifically, Shanahan does this, being able to line up Deebo Samuel in the backfield and Christian McCaffrey out in the slot, and Kyle Juszczyk can be lined up outside as well. And they just have all these different ways to confuse the defense. Also, still a little bit of a workshop here, but I also do think that we saw a little bit of some innovation on the defensive side of the ball, despite the team not being very good as a whole, is the fact that Jonathan Gannon, the first-year head coach for the Cardinals, he was doing some very interesting, and again, a lot of it's about the pre-snap looks that you end up giving, where that's where you have all these different players. If you're looking at a 49ers, where you have all these different positional players lined up on different parts of the field. We also saw Gannon do some very interesting things. He was, of course, the defensive coordinator of the Eagles when they went to the Super Bowl. But just, it was this pre-snap motion of trying to confuse the opposing quarterback. And I'm getting a little bit off track here, but again, I think that as a whole, it's just about the NFL continues to adapt in different ways, and it's always a chess match. And what I think helps so much is having running backs that are able to be really versatile. I also think that specifically Josh Jacobs more so than Barkley, but if you have a little bit of that extra size and a little bit of an extra ability to help out in the pass blocking game, just being a threat at least in that is another way, as I think some of the talent on the defensive front line is about as high as we've ever seen in the NFL. And as a result, we're seeing offensive lines break down a lot faster. We're seeing some of these young quarterbacks struggling to adapt to it, where you have some running backs that are getting paid that are able to be quick options out of the backfield, but also be able to step in there and be a difference maker there. I think that and we'll see about this. I'm not sure how many years he has left on his contract. I can probably look it up right now, but I think an example of somebody who could prove to be very valuable in the running back game as years come is Jaylen Warren of the Pittsburgh Steelers, where he is a real do-it-all guy. Now, the elite talent hasn't necessarily flashed in the way that we've seen some of these other guys yet, but he is one of the best running backs that I watch on any given Sunday in terms of picking up blitzes and stepping up into the hole. But while also being a receiving threat, he had 61 catches this past year, while also providing almost 800 yards rushing on the ground as well. So he's just somebody, again, this is a little bit of a tangent thought here, but I don't think that the running back market as a whole is dead. I think that it's just adapting and it's changing from the hard-nosed heavy hitter guys to a little bit more of the versatility. Now you look at a guy like Derrick Henry, who also just got paid as of this morning, and Henry at this point too now is a little bit old on the older side as well, but has still absolutely shown to be an effective player even in recent years. He gets $8 million per year while he is entering close to his 30s, if not already, as I will double check this as well. But yeah, he just turned 30 years old, and for him to still be getting, $8 million per year, I think that is also still fairly impressive considering the conversations that were being had last offseason. And he's probably one of the last of a dying breed in terms of just being the hard-nosed running back that can put a team on his back that way. He's never really been a receiving threat, but he does, to me, feel like one of those last guys that can play that style of running back and see financial success this deep into his career. The one running back that we saw go, the two running backs we saw in the first round last season were Jahmyr Gibbs and Bijan Robinson, who are dual threats. And I just feel like that's the way that this is shifting. And once that shift does take place, I think we can see the running back market sort of swing back to a more effective market as a whole. But that is all we have time for today. Thank you very much for tuning in to the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you may be keeping up with us. Helps us out a ton. And we will be back same time tomorrow at 2 o'clock. So we will see you then.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn, ain't that great.